And I know you're as anxious as I am to get into close action. But we must bring him right up beside us before we spring this trap. That will test our nerve. And discipline will count just as much as courage.
The Age of Fighting Sail. Part 4. An embarrassing ordeal for the English Admiralty. The wily French admiral had seen the squall coming, and knowing that he could take advantage of the change in weather, had turned his fleet around and headed in the opposite direction, eastward, back toward France. But D'Auvilliers was not outmaneuvering for a face-to-face fight to the death. That had proved to be catastrophic to the French fleet in the 7 Years' War. Instead, he was about to employ a new naval tactic of hit and run, of raking the enemy, particularly in the vulnerable sails and rigging, and then racing away, either to maneuver for another swift strike or to flee for home if that seemed the better alternative. Being on opposite tacks perfectly suited D'Auvilliers' purpose. At a closing speed of around 12 knots, the engagement promised to be a short one, such as things went. But now the winds took a role in the events. The lingering gusts of the squall died into light breezes, and the two fleets began to move past each other at a much slower pace. The delighted Keppel did not even have time to raise the preparatory signal. He immediately ordered the 2 standard flags for battle: line ahead and engage. His ships had spread out during the 3-day chase, and the squall had driven some of them out of the line of battle, but there was no time to reform. Below decks, aboard the Victory and all the other ships of the Grand Fleet, gun crews snatched away the heavy restraining gear that had been secured during the storm. With the swiftness and sureness that came from constant drilling, the gun ports were open, the wooden plugs pulled from the cannon muzzles, powder and shot rammed home, and the long iron snouts run out to the ports. Unlike the French gunners, who preferred to fire high, the British went for the enemy's hull, on the principle that the way to win a battle was to put holes in the hull and to kill men. The Victory's gunners, taking a length of burning fuse and blowing on it until it glowed, waited for the beginning of the downward roll. Then the gun captain yelled, "Fire!" and each gunner touched off his cannon, sending a ball roaring across the water at 1,200 feet per second. There was no time to see what damage the ball had caused. The moment the cannon reached the end of its violent recoil, the gun crew leaped forward to clean it and load it again for the next shot. By now, even the slowest of the Victory's gun crews could clean, load, and aim and fire a cannon in less than 2 minutes. And on this particular morning in the cold Atlantic, it was well that they could. Despite the light wind, the two fleets were passing each other at a combined speed of 6 knots. Keppel shortened sail to slow down, but no ship was opposite another for more than 2 or 3 minutes. Still, that meant in running along the line, each French ship and each English ship was fired on, and that the two fleets could take about an hour in all to pass each other. The heavy cannonballs from the British ships were not doing as much damage to the French hulls as they would have if Keppel had closed the range between the 2 lines. Meanwhile, the French gunners were cutting up British rigging with their high-flying chain and bar shot. The Victory in the center of the British line had already suffered considerable damage when D'Auvilliers' flagship, the Britannia, came down opposite her. As the 2 flagships rolled past each other, the Victory's gunners scored their best shot of the day. In one thundering broadside, they blew open 3 of Britannia's gun ports, making a wide gap in her side and killing many of her crewmen. But the French gunners responded by chopping up so much of the Victory's rigging that her masts began to sway perilously. By 2 p.m., the fleets were out of range and the firing had died. The Victory's masts were threatening to topple over. Smoke swirled through her gun decks, and wounded men lay on the improvised litters in the cockpit waiting for the surgeon to remove splinters of wood or to cut away smashed limbs. Gunners mopped sweat from their bare chests and stuffed wads into their ears, which were bleeding from the concussion of the cannon. On the quarterdeck, Keppel began to assess the damage to his fleet. Those in the rear seemed to be hurt worst, and as Keppel watched, D'Auvilliers appeared to be rounding up as if readying another engagement. Keppel decided to oblige him and signaled the fleet to form a line. At the head of the British line, Vice Admiral Sir Robert Harland, commander of the van, or front squadron, was already coming about. But the Victory, sorely damaged, had to be brought about gently before the wind, nursing her tattered rigging. By 3 p.m., Keppel had his van and center ready, but the ships of his rear had not joined the line. The commander of the rear was Vice Admiral Sir Hugh Palliser. His ship, the Formidable, had been damaged more heavily than Keppel realized from a distance. Her foremast had been shredded by shot, and she was scarcely under way. Since Admiralty regulations required all vessels in a squadron to remain with the leader, the 90-gun Ocean and the 74-gun Elizabeth could not abandon the Formidable to join Keppel. Keppel might have done without the rear and ordered Harland up to the front for an immediate attack. However, he doggedly refused to risk further action until he had his entire fleet in a straight line-ahead formation. He waited impatiently for Palliser and the crippled Formidable to bring up the ships of the rear. 3 whole hours had passed, and Keppel sent a frigate racing back, ordering them to join the line. Still, Palliser delayed while he made emergency repairs. It was dusk before the 3 vessels of the rear formation joined the rest of the fleet. Keppel could see that the French had retained and tightened their line of battle. Though they had suffered many casualties and considerable damage, their sails and riggings were in better shape than those of the British. Consequently, they could maneuver more effectively. Keppel judged that they were ready to renew the battle, but he decided with darkness approaching that it was too late for another engagement. He ordered the fleet to keep in formation until dawn to stay alert for a possible French attack. Through the night, he led his fleet upwind in hopes of regaining the all-important weather gauge. And, through the night, the Victory's crew stood to general quarters, trying to keep awake after the exhausting day. Across the water they could see 3 lanterns, which they took to be the lights of the French fleet still waiting for them. With the dawn, Keppel ruefully discovered that the crafty de Villiers had outsmarted him once again. Only 3 French ships, the ones they had shown the lights, were anywhere near him. While those light-bearing ships served as decoys through the night, de Villiers had coolly sailed off with the bulk of his fleet, and the 3 remaining ships were now adding on sail to rejoin the main body of its escape eastward towards France. With widespread damage to their rigging, the British ships had no hope of catching the enemy. On July 28th, Keppel decided that his fleet was in such disorder aloft that it was unwise to even remain off a hostile coast. He headed for home. Aboard the British fleet, 506 men had been killed or wounded, 35 of them on the Victory itself. No ships had been lost during the ordeal, but on July 31st, when the Grand Fleet reached Spithead, it sailed into a storm of criticism and recrimination. Keppel blamed Palliser for disobeying orders. Both demanded a formal court-martial, and both were exonerated. The controversy exposed an unpleasant and exceedingly dangerous situation within the Royal Navy. It had become politicized. Palliser was an outspoken conservative Tory, and Keppel an ardent liberal Whig. Emotions ran high at the trials. Jubilant Whigs wore light blue ribbons in their hats with Keppel in gold letters. Whig ladies of fashion made and distributed the hats. As Keppel departed from court, a band marched before him, playing He Comes, the Hero Comes. So controversial did this issue become that Keppel refused to serve under the ruling Tory government. He bitterly hauled down his flag, left the Victory, and retired to await the downfall of the Tories. As for Admiral de Villiers, in late July he made it safely back to Brest, and a hero's welcome. He had been at sea challenging British rule for the better part of a month, and though he had lost 674 men through death or wounds, not a French ship had been sunk. In this sense, the Battle of Ushant was the first French success in more than a decade since the 7 Years' War. Ushant proved a vastly important point about the changing nature of naval warfare. By refusing to attack the enemy in anything but the traditional line-ahead formation, Keppel had assured de Villiers' escape. The lesson, however, was utterly lost on the hidebound British Admiralty. In fact, one of the criticisms of Keppel's tactics was that he came into battle in the first instance without reassembling his disordered line. But how could he have accomplished this with the French line already plowing past him? The Admiralty could not say. The clear message of the Battle of Ushant was that the textbook tactics were no longer good enough. French ships were much improved, and the French hit-and-run tactics crippling the enemy rigging and running away could not be countered by the powerful but inflexible line of battle that had served the Royal Navy so well up till now. But the Admiralty had not recognized this message, and now England was plunged into naval war in which only a major change of tactics could save her from disaster. Fortunately for England, the Royal Navy, seemingly so traditional-minded, would come up with the very tactics it needed to meet and defeat the French in the long series of great engagements that would stretch almost 30 years into the future, from Ushant in 1778 to Trafalgar in 1805. A chief designer of the new tactics would be the same Horatio Nelson who had arrived, aged 12, at the docks of Chatham in 1771. At the time of the Battle of Ushant, Nelson was serving with the West Indies Station, the small fleet in the Caribbean that was trying to deal with the privateers of France and the rebellious American colonies, which were both preying on British ships. Now, 20 and a lieutenant, Nelson was rising fast in the service. His boldness and initiative had been recognized by Captain William Locker, master of the Lowestoft, on which Nelson was serving. Locker soon recommended the young Nelson to Sir Peter Parker, newly assigned to command the West Indies Station. Parker, equally impressed with the young officer, gave Nelson his first command in the winter of 1778, the brig Badger. But it was the advice given to him by Captain Locker that Nelson would never forget. "Always lay a Frenchman close, and you will beat him." Bold, aggressive, close infighting would become Nelson's trademark, and the essence of the new tactics that would make the Royal Navy once again supreme. But it would still be a while before the Royal Navy was prepared to break with its traditional ways, and in the meantime it was fated to suffer further embarrassment.